Okay, so I'm Nati Raehl, and the title of my project is actually called Examining Wage Discrimination in Major League Soccer. And before I start, I'd just like to thank my advisor and faculty mentor, Dr. Clinton Warren, for guiding me through the research process, as well as just making this virtual experience a lot more easier. Also, before I start, I'd just like to give a little bit of an overview of what Major League Soccer is exactly, because at the beginning of the summer, it was a little bit new to me as well. So Major League Soccer is a relatively new sports league when as compared to other professional leagues in North America, as it started in 1996 and now is comprised of 26 teams spanning from the USA to Canada. Um, so let's dive into the introduction. So our study really came at a very opportune time as Major League Soccer is going through diversity and inclusion changes in their infrastructure. On June 18th, otherwise known as Juneteenth, a group of Major League Soccer players actually came together and created what's known as now as the Black Player Coalition. The BPC will address the racial inequalities in the league, stand with all those fighting against racism in the world of soccer, and also positively impact all Black communities across the United States as well as Canada. So wage discrimination, as you can understand, or as you can expect, has been extensively studied in both the workplace and sports industry, especially player wage discrimination. But beyond player wage discrimination, there's also been a lot of research on coaching and hiring practices on the basis of race as well. As we see in many sports leagues, especially North American sports leagues, there's a high majority, despite a majority of the players being players of color, such as the NBA and the NFL, where we see 80, 70, 80% of the players being players of color, there's still high amounts of white people in management positions, which are causes for concern in this big disparity. And but unfortunately, recently we've seen a newfound push on inclusivity and opportunity spanning across several sports. One of these is the Washington football team in the NFL just changed their name to the Washington football team, and were formerly known as the Washington Redskins, but that was deemed derogatory and offensive. And they're still going through a logo and team name, but they're definitely going in the right direction there. Also in the NFL in 2016, we saw Colin Kaepernick and countless others kneel to protest police brutality and just inequality in the U.S. in general. And then more recently, actually on June 10th, we saw NASCAR ban the Confederate flag from all their events to promote inclusivity in their sport as well. Moving on to the methods portion of our study. So player salary data was collected from the Major League Soccer Players Union annual salary reports. And then all race and national origin data was also collected from the official Major League Soccer website. And then our data set spans from 2011 to 2019. And so the crux of our study really was our linear regression model, where we looked at how a bunch of independent variables would affect our dependent variable. And so our independent variables in our model were of various performance player metrics, because we know that obviously that performance dictates salary or has a big effect on salary, as well as player position, and then of course a player's race, and then a player's region of origin. So those were a mix of our 13 independent variables, which affected the dependent variable in our study, which was base annual salary. So after the linear regression model was set up, follow-up t-test was run just to look at two region of origin groups and compare those two and the disparity between the two. And the two groups we chose to look at were white and Black players in our model. So looking at the results section of our study, the linear regression model predicted 22.3% of the variance in player salary with a statistical significance value of under 0.01. So that value might seem a little bit low, but since we're not in a scientific field and we're looking at human subjects, which are harder to predict rather than objects, that value being lower is more acceptable. And then on top of that, 8 of our 13 independent variables were found to be statistically significant as well, with a p-value of under 0.05, which also adds to the validity of our model as well. So more importantly, race and region of origin were found to be significant predictors of annual salary, with statistical significance values of under 0.001. And then After running our t-test, we also found that Black players are paid on average $57,359 less than their white counterparts when holding all else constant. And then looking at regional differences, players from Europe end up earning the most at $632,142, while players from the Caribbean end up earning the least at $175,688. So as you can see here, Table 1 kind of gives us a look at the Major League Soccer player pool by racial grouping and their frequency across the data set. And then Table 2 provides us with player pool by region of origin. And then Player 3 looks at our independent variables and which ones were deemed statistically significant, which are marked by asterisks. Moving on to the discussion portion, in order to really understand the values of the results section, we have to understand that Major League Soccer differs from the other major sports professional leagues in North America in the way that that salary is determined. In sports such as the NBA or the MLB or the NFL, we see salaries ranging from as low as $500,000 to $50 million per year, or 30 or 40 million per year. And team spendings can be up in the hundreds of millions. But in Major League Soccer, the average annual player salary is $400,000. The median salary is $179,000, and over a third of the players make less than $100,000. So looking at that, definitely going back to that number of $57,359, we see how big of a significance that is in Major League Soccer when looking at those values in the discussion section. Beyond that, this study is really the first to examine discrimination based on race using more than 3 racial groupings. So we saw other studies look at or use racial groupings by using Black, white, and mixed, or Black, white, Hispanic, or white and all other people of color. But our study kind of went further and did 6 racial groupings as well as 10 region of origin groupings, just to provide a better examination of wage discrimination in general. Additionally, this study is the first to really use advanced player metrics in the model, and this just made our model more detailed and also provided us with a more thorough examination of wage discrimination as well. So looking forward into the future with these results, we will look to present our findings to the newly formed Black Player Coalition, as I explained before, or maybe even future player bargaining, collective bargaining agreements. And we would contend that, or we would present these findings and contend that Caribbean players are being paid too little in regards to their performance standards, while European players might be actually getting paid a premium in regard to their performance standards as well. So looking forward in the future, I'm definitely looking to expand in this project as maybe part of a graduate school capstone thesis project or whatever. And what I do in continuing this project is maybe designate what are called designated players from the data set, or players that earn a lot more money than quote unquote normal players would. And so excluding these few players from our data set would help us to provide a more valid model and just make the study more valid as a whole. And then also I'd look to find a better way to label player race, because we had limited information on the Major League Soccer website. And also we had to look at profile pictures as well to identify racial grouping. So finding maybe a little better way just to be more detailed and effective in producing our model would be a great way as well. So that was my research project. And I'd like to thank Heidi and Vicky as well for making this summer a great summer despite the circumstances we were in. So I guess I'll open the floor up for questions now.
Hey, Nati, really good job. The only thing I was going to ask you to do, that you did a really good job of explaining how different MLS is. When you talk about the designated player rule, do you have any ideas as to what some of those players make? Like you said, the average is like 400,000. Some players get paid as low as 50, 60,000. Yeah. What's a good example of a designated player and what a player like that gets?
A player like who? Sorry.
Like a David Beckham. Some of those designated players that earn a lot. Like, what is a lot in MLS?
Okay. So actually this year, the highest earner in Major League Soccer is 7.2 million, I think. I can't remember his name. It's a longer name.
Is that Ibrahimovic?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So he's making 7.2 million. So that'd be considered the most in the league. If that answers your question.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think it's really illustrative just to how different MLS looks compared to other leagues. Thanks.
Yeah, and then in the NFL, we just saw Patrick Mahomes is making now 50 million per year.
Yeah.
So it's just such a big difference between the two.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I have a question. So do you look at like cross correlations between parameters? Because I assume that if you play up top, your likelihood of having like more goals, more shots on goal and all that kind of stuff is going to be correlated. So I guess how do you handle that? And then with what you're saying with the European players kind of getting paid a premium, is there a way to quantify that? Or I wonder if that's something you could work into your model, because I definitely think that's true, and we pay a lot to have these like washed up players come play in the US, but it's like name recognition and getting money to the league. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's something I'll look at definitely in future parts of the study as well. But we do know that European players tend to make more, and we do know that a lot of designated players tend to come from Europe, which also skews the numbers up for that European grouping as well. So, but we'll definitely look into that part and maybe add that as a part of my thesis capstone project or whatever. So yeah.
Nati, do you think there's a correlation between like country GDP compared to how much the players get paid, which could be also contributing as a factor?
I didn't look at that, but that could be something interesting to look at in future projects. I don't know exactly what that relationship is.
I have a question too. Have you looked and did you draw any literature from like European leagues, or do you hypothesize that the wage discrimination would be different, let's say in like the Premier League or other things? And also like maybe with like the national teams.
No, I didn't look at too much of the national team or even European too much. I mostly focused on Major League Soccer, just USA and Canada for the most part for my study.
Nati, I think this is a great study and very quantitative, and I think by all means you should communicate this to the BPC, and that's a wonderful outcome of research. Does MLS have a salary cap, and is that a factor in sort of suppressing salaries for a large number of players to afford those high dollar ones?
I don't think they do have a salary cap, which differs them from European soccer leagues, if I'm right, Dr. Warren.
Yeah, MLS is weird. So they do and they don't. They have a salary cap for the base players, like you said, the quote unquote normal players.
But then the designated
that has to fit, and that does suppress it. But then since they have, I think right now teams have up to 4 designated player spots, they could spend whatever they want on those players. They could buy Lionel Messi for 30 million if they wanted to. They don't. But so it's a tricky question. It's like they do, but they kind of don't, because they can continue spending beyond, which is why you see the data set looks a little strange, as Nati had talked about.
And that's what I'm saying. We'll fix with the designated player model in the future. By taking those out, it'll just make a more valid model in general.
It'd be interesting too to look at like in designated players if there's a discrepancy beyond that, because I wonder too with this, you're paying them extra and they're coming from bigger leagues, but then I wonder then the point that they're older, maybe not as good, if you then start to see a really big discrepancy there.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to look at too as well.
I have one last goofy question. When you specify a European player, is that a player of European descent, or, for example, what about a player from Africa who had a great career in the Premier League and then came to U.S. MLS? Is that a European player, or
like I said, we had very limited information, so I would look at the Major League Soccer website, and usually it'd say most of the players were just like Albania, Spain, or whatever. just European, but there are also portions where Black players came from Europe. It's just all based off of where you were born or possibly raised. If you can't get the information of where you were born on the Major League Soccer website. But otherwise, it's just basically straightforward where you were born, non-moving or anything. There's no other factors really to it.
Yeah, so less to do with their playing experience.
Yeah.
More to do with where they're from. Yeah.